Hello, thank you so much for tuning in to this presentation. My name is Elisabeth Staal, and I manage education programs at Washington Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. In my current role, I work on arts programs in D.C. public schools and other area schools. This work includes ensuring that our programs are accessible to all students, no matter their ability or whether they are in a self-contained class or not. I also work really closely with our teaching artists, and this includes doing anything I can to help prepare them to teach the students in front of them, whether they have a disability or not. I'm also still an active arts educator at Imagination Stage in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside DC, and there I teach as well as act as an inclusion facilitator. Imagination Stage is an organization with robust education programs that are inclusive of all students, which means that my classes have students with and without disabilities. Previously, I worked at Boston Ballet, where I was working on community programs in an administrative and teaching assistant capacity. And I primarily worked on the adaptive dance program, which is a program for students with intellectual and developmental disability ages 2 through adult. Something that I've observed as I either present at or attend conferences, interact with teaching artists, and plan lessons and curriculum myself is that it's so easy to feel overwhelmed learning about all these different options for accommodations and strategies. We're told more and more things to consider and know as we teach, and we try to find the best resources. But how do we determine which resources we should be focusing on and choosing? And no one does their best teaching when they're overwhelmed. So I am here with this presentation to hopefully offer you 20 minutes to take a step back, take a breath, and revise how we can distill all this information so it feels manageable. I'm not here claiming to be an expert, rather, I'm here hoping to support you, the experts of your classroom, students, and fields. So in the rest of our time together, we will be going through the following. First, we will engage in a mindset reset, where we will take a step back and reset our perspectives about arts education for students with disabilities. Then, with our refresh perspective, we will go back to the basics of how we think about the goals and purposes of arts education spaces. This will include the standards we hold ourselves to and how we approach our own work. These redefined goals will ground us so we can take a look at one approach to identifying barriers in an arts classroom, and then how we can determine what strategies and accommodations we use to address those barriers. I hope this portion leaves you feeling ready to go through your own bucket of techniques and accommodations and finding what will work for your classroom and your students. To end, I will share some of my favorite but basic and helpful resources that are easily incorporated into a class. Many of these props you'll already know about or use, but I want to emphasize how sometimes the basic solution is the right solution. It can really go a long way, which is really easy to forget when we're so deep in this work all the time. I'll also share one way I like to approach digesting and implementing new strategies as I intake new information, whether at conferences or from peers. The goals listed in front of you reflect this outline, and they are to reset our perspective about arts education for students with disabilities, adjust the standards we hold ourselves to as we approach creating inclusive arts education experiences, and to feel more confident in identifying barriers and implementing accommodations in a way that is manageable and realistic. So let's begin with our mindset reset. I invite you to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you, and to take a deep breath. Take a moment to remember what brought you to this conference, to this session. By the very nature of you attending this conference, that is indicative to me that you're willing to go that extra mile to be the best educator you can be and to provide for your students. There are a lot of competing priorities going on, so let's use this time to make this all feel a bit more manageable. There are a few points I want us to focus on as we take this moment to take a step back. First, you cannot be every student's one-to-one aid. and that's okay. Second, you can't master every skill at once, and no one, especially yourself, should expect that of you. And third, together, I want us to let go of the fear of doing things wrong and just focus on finding what works and knowing that it's going to be a process, and that process might be messy, but that's okay. I hope these reminders serve as groundwork as we continue and begin to think about planning and our classes specifically. If your eyes were closed, I ask that you open them now as we dive into the next section. Next, we'll revisit the basics of how we think about our arts education spaces. To begin our journey back to the basics, I want to talk about recognizing our role in the classroom. I think it's important because often we want to be everything for everyone, and we just can't do that. So I ask you to think of, in the most basic way, what's your role for your students? Is it to teach dance, music, art? Is it to provide a safe learning environment? Whatever you identify your role to be is going to lead you to the goal of that class, also on a very basic level. To use myself as an example, if I'm the lead teacher for a dance class, then I can't also be the occupational therapist and a teaching assistant and an aide. I have to let myself do what I'm there to do, and that's to teach dance. Rooting myself in this purpose aids me in my planning by helping me find the line between trying to be everything for everyone and providing realistic support from where I sit. It also helps keep me focused on the goal of that class and helps me from getting wrapped up in the day-to-day. But before continuing with our discussion about planning, I want to say that I'm not here to tell you how to plan. I know you know how to plan for your own classes and your own students. Instead, I just want this to be time to refocus on some core concepts of how we can approach adjusting our plans and how we can incorporate new strategies as we learn them, whether it's from peers or conferences. As we approach lesson planning, I want us to remember that disability is diversity, and diversity needs to be something we expect and plan for. If we do this, then it will be harder for us to feel surprised or caught off guard when a student needs something different. Because then we won't be assuming that all of our students are going to respond in the same way or need the same thing. Instead of us thinking that some students need something different, I encourage us to think about how all of our students will approach a lesson and respond in their own ways. I ask you to think once again about your role in the classroom. If it is to introduce students to a style of dance, to keep going with my example, then what is the ideal outcome for those students? If it's for the students to leave the class having participated and learned about this style, then that can look very different for each student. Keeping this in mind can alleviate me from being caught up on everyone doing or achieving the exact same thing or responding in a uniform way. This helps me focus on the authentic participation from each student and knowing that it's going to look different and unique. I also pose the question when planning, what are neurotypical and/or able-bodied peers experiencing? Once I can identify the experience of neurotypical and/or able-bodied peers, then I can identify the barrier preventing my students with disabilities from receiving that same experience. Once finding that barrier, I can then build backwards and create a pathway to getting all my students to that goal by breaking down where the barriers are happening. To facilitate this thought process for myself, I've incorporated it into a planning tool that helps me as I do my own planning. This planning tool that my screen's now showing works in tandem with my greater scope and sequence of my classes. So this planning tool that I'm sharing, I use it to focus on building in accommodations as I plan. I know you all have your own planning templates and tools, and mine is by no means the end all be all. I just primarily want to share it to provide an example of how we can consider planning for the different abilities of our students from the beginning. At the top of the planning tool, I have the class as well as the overall class goal. Sometimes how we think of success can be a barrier to our own teaching. And this is where going back to the basic of what our goal is really helpful to help us stay centered and rooted in that. This goal reminds me of what success would actually look like. If the goal is to participate, then it's okay for participation to look different. All participation is valid, as we kind of mentioned previously. And that would also mean that all participation, no matter what it looks like, would mean that all my students are being successful in class. In this example, the goal of my musical theater class for grades 3 through 4 is for students to engage in the process of learning a song, choreography, and putting it together as an ensemble. This means I need to stay focused on the engagement and participation and not on the mastering choreography or song lyrics or anything like that. Below that is a section for me to keep track of notes. Oops, sorry, skipped ahead by accident. So yes, below that is a section for me to keep notes about a specific student or a group of students, depending what your class is like. Here I have retracted the student's name and replaced their name with the word student for your own reference. Here I simplify my notes into 2 categories. One being challenges the student has during class, and the second being things that work well for them during class. So first, under challenges student has during class, I have focus for long periods of time, particularly when being stationary and are actively being spoken to by the lead teacher, keeping a safe and quiet body when watching peers, and fatigue. Then beneath that, under things that have worked well with the student during class, I have a core board with reminders, particularly the reminders, quiet feet, nice hands, sit and stand are really helpful, a visual schedule, and a poly spot as a visual floor marker. I like to have this section at the top, so as I plan specific lessons, I can easily reference back to it. And then below this section, I begin to plan for a lesson. As I mentioned, this works in tandem with my greater scope and sequence plan. So in this section, I write the name. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I keep accidentally skipping ahead. So in this section, I write the name or descriptor of the lesson, and then I write the date it's being delivered. Then below this, I list out 3 ways to convey this lesson with a reminder to refer to the Universal Design for Learning principles of engagement, representation, and action and expression. That's what that little thank you DL reminder is for myself. At its core, this breaks down to multimodal teaching if you're not familiar with UDL. So here, I write that to begin teaching students choreography for one short day from Wicked, I'm going to verbally explain the choreography and steps, demonstrate it, and then have them try it. Right below this section, I write to go back and add ways to scaffold the above activities. So my bullets in blue are just that. This is where I go back and add ways to make these adjustments with the notes about my student being referenced. So when I'm verbally explaining choreography, I'm going to say the student's name often and always show what I'm saying by either doing it at the same time or having printed out vocab words to help keep their focus. I'll also let all students sit down if they need to during this part to give them a break and help prevent that fatigue. And I do this for each of the activities in the class. I find it really helpful to think through these things ahead of time. And I'm a visual learner myself. And so having the notes about my student, all this laid out like this, is just really helpful for my own preparation. It helps me remember to actively incorporate the things I know about my student as I'm planning instead of trying to add them in at the last minute. Now, this isn't a perfect tool and it might not work for you, but I encourage you to think of how you could build in a similar process in your own plans as you think about incorporating strategies and accommodations in a way that'll feel manageable to you and just built into the planning time that you're already doing. Now, before we continue, I just want to take a moment to alleviate any need to know a child's diagnosis or to be an expert on, say, autism spectrum disorder or any other disability in order to do this work. I mean, the example we just walked through with my planning tool, we didn't know this student's diagnosis, and we were still able to make these adjustments to our plan just based on what we observe and know about them. While a diagnosis can definitely open doors for supports and services, it's not essential to providing accessible arts lessons. We don't need to find lessons for students with insert disability here. We just need to find lessons for students and then ways of scaffolding based on what we know about them. We don't need to take a cue from a label, that label being their diagnosis. We should instead take cues from each student's exhibited interest. Exhibited interest and behavior tell us a lot about our students. So on that note, let's talk a little bit more about behavior. So behavior can tell us so much by giving us clues to what our students need, but sometimes it can also take a very long time to figure out what they need, which I'm sure you all know and have experienced yourselves. But ultimately, we know that behavior is communication, and a student's behavior is giving us clues about something. This is the basic reminder I want to provide to all of you. Just don't discount behavior. Listen to it. Ideally, a student's behavior can show us what motivates them, and then we can use that motivator later on when they're having a hard time participating in class. But oftentimes we see behavior in a way that's disruptive to the class experience, and that behavior is telling us that they need something else in that moment. Do they need a break, either sitting or going for a walk? Is it too loud? Do they need headphones? Do they have a lot of pent-up energy, and could heavy work be helpful here? Maybe also a walk in that case. Trying to figure this out can take a lot of time. It's a process, and it will often feel frustrating. And it's really easy to get frustrated and feel overwhelmed when you're trying things and they're not working. So this is where it's really helpful to have a record of strategies or accommodations that you've heard about and liked, but maybe just haven't had a moment to implement or give it a try yet. So this is an example then of a template that I use at conferences, but can easily be translated into a more general tracker of information. This is what I use at conferences to keep track of my favorite takeaways, and so I can refer to them later. It's really, really simple, but it gets the job done, at least for me. And my focus here is to keep track of the concepts that I really like and want to remember, then who presented it in case I want to get in contact with them later, some key points or notes that I find most helpful or remember, most helpful or important to remember, and then finally space for me to think of ways I could actually use this concept in action. This helps me convert something from an idea to an action really quickly when I'm still feeling inspired and creative from whatever presentation or discussion I just engaged in. Similarly to the planning tool that I just shared, this might not work for you, or you may need something different. But if you don't currently have a way of keeping track of all the great information you hear during this conference, then I encourage you to maybe give this one a try and to keep track of the things that you want to keep in your back pocket to potentially use in your classes later on. Speaking of putting things in practice, these are some of my favorite basic props that I found to be practical and really helpful consistently. So the first one is poly spots. I love poly spots. Not a huge surprise as someone who teaches a lot of dance. They're a great visual floor marker that eliminates the abstract concept of standing there. Scarves can be used in so many ways, but my go-tos are a visual for how music sounds, so like fast or slow, as well as an access point for movement. If someone's nervous about moving, it could be helpful. Yeah, there are lots of ways to use scarves. A visual schedule, there are a lot of students who really need to know what's coming up next and where we are in the lesson, and crossing off items on the schedule can be a great reward. And these three things I have in every class, regardless if I have students with disabilities or not. I just find that they elevate everyone's experience regardless of who's in the room. So I just always use those. Now, a PT balance disc is really great for students that can't sit still, because when they sit on the disc, they have to engage their core to stay balanced. And so it kind of contains that energy and that movement into their seat a little bit. Noise canceling headphones are really great for students with sound sensitivities. And then augmentative and alternative communication tools, such as a core board, for students who need a visual to digest information or who communicate through visuals, with either it being a picture, words, or a combination of the two. I'm sure at least a few of these things are familiar to you. Maybe you already use some of them or all of them, but I just always think it's a good reminder that we don't always have to have the most expensive or complex props or strategies. Often basic solutions can go a really long way, and it's easy to discount them when we're so deep in this work. So I think it's always a good reminder. As we come to a close, I just have one more simple reminder I want to offer you. Don't forget to find your supports. When spending so much time working on supporting your students, it's really easy to forget to find support for yourself. As we talked about, you can't be everything for everyone. So seek out in-class support as you're able and you can and need to. Get information from parents about strategies that work well with their kids, and find your peers, colleagues, and mentors that you can turn to. Thank you so much for virtually joining me today, and thank you for doing what you do. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if I can continue to be a support to you in any way. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Able Assembly.